Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of this two-part series. We're in Marvelous Designer and we're working on finishing this utility belt from Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Want to mention very quickly that in the description below there's a free Marvelous Designer project file and all the 3D assets seen here. I will also include a link to the reference images. For the final render, I added more detail and textured and painted. If you would like the project files for both Blender and Substance Painter, you can check those out in the description below as well. Okay, let's get started. I've already added all the fabrics that we will use for part 2, so if you would like to, you can take a moment now to add them as well. Let's grab the rectangle tool and we'll use this to create the base pattern piece where we'll attach our pouches. Change the width to 24 and the height to 4.5. Let's move it back. We'll change the display to textured surface so that we can see the back fabric face and make sure that we are sewing this to the correct side. Right-click the pattern piece and select Flip Normal so that we can switch the face of the fabric. Let's add a point in the middle, and then we will use the free sewing tool to sew this pattern to the belt. Lower the particle distance, and change the fabric to knit fleece terry. And then let's simulate. For the first pouch, select the rectangle. We'll input 8.5 for the width and height. Let's go ahead and change the fabric to trim hardware, and let's lower the particle distance. Duplicate the back pattern piece, flip the normal, and let's change the fabric to trim full grain leather. Now that we have the front and back pattern pieces, let's work on the sides. We'll duplicate the front pattern piece, rearrange it to the side, and reduce its size. We'll add a point here, and then convert this point to a curve point so that we can add roundness to the bottom. Continue to make adjustments until you are happy with the curvature and shape. Once we have it, let's add an internal line and change the distance to 0.4. Freeze the back pattern piece and let's sew these together. In the 2D pattern window, right-click on the side pattern piece and select Symmetric Pattern with Sewing. This will copy and link the side pattern pieces. Select the sewing lines on the side pattern pieces and change the fold angle to 90. Let's adjust the front pattern piece by extending the height to match the length of the curve on the side pattern piece. Select both pattern outlines, and with the Transform Segment tool, left-click, and as we drag, right-click. Change the height to 10.72. Let's add internal lines and change the distance to 0.1. And cut and sew. We want to add some stability on the bottom, so add an internal line on the front pattern piece. Cut and sew. And then let's also duplicate this pattern piece. This next part depends on your workflow, but if you wanted to add more wrinkles and folds in Marvelous, one way we could do this is to add another pattern piece on top and adjust the shrinkage warp and weft. Let's start with the side pattern pieces. Right-click and select Layer Clone Over. Change the fabric to leather lambskin. And change shrinkage warp to 105. Let's repeat the same process for the front pattern piece. We'll change the weft to 105 and the warp to 110. Simulate and continue to make more adjustments as needed. For the flap, let's duplicate the front pattern piece. We'll reset the weft and warp to 100. And let's change the fabric to nylon featherweight. Let's offset the pattern outline at the top and change the distance to 0.4. And cut and sew. Remove the sewing lines between the new pattern piece and the back pattern piece. And then we'll re-sew the flap to the back pattern piece. Let's make some adjustments to the fold angles of the sewing lines. For the sewing line between the new pattern piece and the flap, let's change the fold angle to 270. For the flap to the back pattern piece, Change the fold angle to 90. If you want your flap to lie flatter, then you could always lower the additional thickness collision underneath the simulation properties in the property editor. Let's use an internal line as a reference for where we need to add the point so that we can drag our pattern outline inward. Next, let's use internal lines to add our trim. And we'll change the distance to 0.4. And then let's cut and sew. I want to extend the width of the flap a bit more, so let's undo the trim that we just created and work on making the flap wider. Let's try extending the width here to see what happens. Okay, it's still not quite wide enough, so let's extend it a bit more. Okay, that's not quite what we're looking for, so let's go ahead and undo that and see how we can fix this. Okay, I think I see the problem. Let's go ahead and change the weft and warp back to the original values that we had. When we duplicated the front pattern piece, we ended up resetting those values. Okay, that looks better. Let's change the values back to 100 for the top pattern piece. Continue to make further adjustments if needed. Once we finish with that, let's go ahead and recreate our trim. Let's quickly add some more details to the pouch. I'll speed this part up and explain as I go. So we are going to create the loop pattern piece that sits on the inner side of the pouch. For this, we will duplicate the front pattern piece, resize it, and sew it to the side pattern piece. Next, we will add the buttons. I changed the shape to snap rivet 05, the width to 0.3, and the thickness to 2. I duplicated the first button and repositioned the rest. Once I added all the buttons, I deactivated them. Now let's work on the small pouch. Duplicate the back pattern piece of the first pouch. And change the fabric to trim hardware. For the dimensions, let's change the width to 7 and the height to 4. With the Smooth Curve tool, we will round the corners to 1. Duplicate the back pattern piece and then flip the normal. For the side pattern pieces, we'll create a new rectangle. Let's highlight the pattern outline so that we can input the measurement for the height. For the width, input 1, and for the height, we'll input 14.23. Let's go ahead and grab the rectangle, position it, and prepare it for sewing. Freeze the back, and let's use the free sewing tool to attach it to the back and front pattern pieces. Let's change the fold angles to 90 and lower the particle distance. To create the flap, let's duplicate the back and sew it to the back pattern piece. We'll change the fabric to nylon featherweight. And change the fold angle to 90. Let's also change the additional thickness collision to 0. Let's work on adjusting the shape of the flap. Let's add a point here. We'll delete this point. Let's pull this down a bit. We'll add another point here and extend this point. And then let's add a curve point between these two. We'll add a curve point here and then continue to make adjustments. To add more wrinkles and folds, let's extend the pattern outline. For the front pattern piece, let's try layer clone under. change the top layer to leather lambskin. And then let's change the weft and warp to 110. Okay, once we're finished with the small pouch, we can go ahead and arrange all the pouches. For the first pouch, we can copy and mirror paste it to the other side as well. One last thing I wanted to talk about was the bottle straps. I have already created them, but I just wanted to mention a couple of features for working with trims. If you right-click the bottle, there are a few simulation options. Right now, the bottle is frozen, but we can use this cloth to show examples of how each of these options work. If we choose freeze, the cloth will collide with the bottle, but it will not be affected by gravity. If we activate it, the cloth will collide with the bottle and is also affected by the weight of the cloth and gravity. If we choose deactivate, the cloth will not collide with the bottle and it will not be affected by gravity. The trim features were helpful when thinking about how to approach creating the straps. I wanted to use the bottle just as a placeholder, and being able to cycle through these different options made this process a bit easier. If you want to see more of the process behind the bottle straps and working with different types of trims, just let me know and I can post another video detailing this workflow. So this is the end of part 2. Everything you see here is available for free in the links in the description. Please feel free to leave comments and questions. I would love to hear your feedback, especially if there's anything that we can do to improve these videos. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.